Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic will be those unexpected intermediate moves. Let's get started with the first example, which is from a real game that was played between David and Atalik. In the position in front of us, materially speaking, the position is equal. However, it is quite noticeable the difference in safety between the two kings. Why do I say that? Well, it is because the white king is safely near the corner on b1 with two of his own pawns in front of it, while on the other side of the board, the black king is pretty vulnerable with no pawns directly in front of it. Well, the only hope that black has is that we're almost in an endgame. But there is a big difference between almost and being there. So for example, if white right now would trade rooks, that would bring the game certainly to an endgame. And in that case, all of a sudden, the fact that the black king is not as protected as white's becomes irrelevant. The king's safety is really important in the beginning and in the middle of the game when there are still a board full of pieces. Why? Because generally only in those cases the king can be successfully attacked. So in this case, therefore, it is certainly in white's interest to keep pieces on the board and not to trade. Only to allow exchange of pieces if that immediately and concretely will result in material or other gain. In this position, white has two excellent choices. One would be to indeed simply move the rook away from that offer of exchange of rooks and now attack black's pawn on h5, but more importantly, simply bring the pieces towards the black king and attack. Another excellent choice would be to play queen c5 with similar ideas to again attack the pawn on h5, and then this is of course in view that if now black would indeed trade rooks, the queen would capture back with a check, and that would guarantee win of material for white, as after the black king gets out of check, the black bishop on b7 will be lost. So these would have been the good choices for white. But instead, white became creative and in the meantime forgot about an unexpected resource of the opponent. That's another very important element, that when you're looking for your good moves or even combinations, at all times you need to be in the search for your opponent's best moves as well. It's a big mistake that a lot of inexperienced players do, that they simply are looking for what they want to see, how they're gonna win, instead of trying to look at the situation objectively and realistically, because obviously on the other side of the board the opponent will try to look for the best that he or she can find as a response or as a defense. So therefore, when you play chess, when you do your analysis during a game, you constantly not only need to look for your own good moves, but always also your opponent's best responses. The tricky move that white played here was rook takes bishop, which at the superficial glance looks like a wonderful idea, because after rook captures rook, and this was an exchange sacrifice, now the white queen can capture on e4, checking the black king, and simultaneously attacks the rook on b7. Obviously, the king cannot move out of the check in a way that it would protect the rook, so therefore, if you stop your calculation here, that check, king moves out, queen takes rook, I won material, good deal, let's go for it, that would be a big mistake. And that's exactly what white did. forgetting that now black can block the check, and more importantly, this move doesn't only block the check, but also at the same time pins the white queen. And that means the white queen is not allowed now to capture on b7 because of the pin. The king is not allowed to remain in attack, and therefore white is pretty much forced to exchange the queens, and then the black king will be getting active without any danger whatsoever, as there are almost no pieces left on the board, and the black king and rook will simply go after the weak white pawns on the other side of the board, on the king's side, far away from the white king or knight, the pieces that could potentially defend those pawns. And therefore white resigned. Well, let's go on to our next example that was pretty interesting as well. Here we are. This is also a position from a regular tournament game, and white here has several interesting looking moves that we need to investigate. It seems that white can, in this position, win a pawn actually with various ways. Let's first check what happens if white chooses to play rook captures pawn on d6. Looks like certainly a natural and good idea. Not only captures a pawn, but also gains time by attacking the black queen. So far things look quite promising. The problem is that black can do better than just moving the queen out of the way. And it's always important to be aware of the forceful moves of the opponent. As we know, those are possible checks or captures, or sometimes the attack of a major piece like a queen or a rook. So right now, after the rook captures on d6, try to think what else can black do other than moving his queen. Hopefully you will discover real quick that the correct choice is now rook captures knight. What happens here is that if now rook captures the queen, then black is winning. First of all, black would just take the queen on e4, which would leave black with an extra knight, but in this case black can do even better by first capturing the rook with a check, another intermediate move, and now after king e1, even better than capturing the queen would be to checkmate immediately. So as we can see, this certainly is not a good idea for white, because after rook takes knight, black at least wins a knight. A better choice is relatively for white here is capturing black's rook, but then also the black queen will capture the white rook on d6, and the extra knight of course is more than sufficient to win the game, assuming that both players play well from here on. Let's go back and look at one of the other tricky alternatives, which would be for white to capture the pawn on e5. Now the idea is that if rook captures knight, then the knight on f4 is unprotected, so white would capture that knight. And it seems that if pawn captures the knight, then there was a pin, and now black loses his queen. However, again, it's one of those moments when it's important not to stop the calculation prematurely. Generally, until you see forceful moves, you should keep going with the variation. So right now, after rook takes, black can obviously recapture, and that's again with a check. And then hopefully an idea that's already familiar to you from a previous variation. Now black checkmates with rook to c1. How nice. Let's go back one more time and let's just see a couple of moves of what happened in the actual game, where white chose the relatively best choice in the position, which was to capture the pawn with the knight. At least in this case, black doesn't have an immediate and forceful way to win the game. Nevertheless, black's attack is quite strong even here, and it's quite clear that the white king being on d1 in the middle of the board is in a lot more danger than its counterpart on the king side. Black continued in the game by playing queen c7, which is a forceful move in a way, because it immediately threatens to checkmate by bringing the rook down to c1. White therefore retreated the knight to c4, preventing that very threat, and now black continued with rook d8. The general rule of thumb is not to exchange pieces when you're attacking. However, this is an exception from that, because black is removing the best defender that white has in the position, namely the rook that's in front of the king. White captured, and the queen captured back with a check. King moved to c2, and now black is dominating the d-file. The idea is to penetrate to white's position, get the rook to d1, and then try to get both the rook and the queen to the first rank. For example, if right now white would be greedy and grab the pawn, black would continue the attack with rook d2 check, king b1, another check, and now the queen also comes to the attack with queen d2, and after queen c2, now play f6, a very important move that attempts to chase away the knight. And if the knight moves away, then knight d3 check, and white is in trouble. Or if white would try to trade queens first, then check, and unfortunately the king needs to move to a square that will step into a forking position. So now, even though after king c1 the rook is hanging on d2, the rook will go back simply, for example, to d5. Now the white knight is under attack, and when it moves, then finally here comes the fork. A very nice variation that demonstrates how black would win after knight takes e5. So let's go back to the position here, couple more moves back. In this position, white actually played better, understanding the dangers, and moved the rook out of this potential fork, moving the rook to f3. And now black simply protected the e5 pawn, and the game went on quite a bit longer, but eventually black won the game. Of course, the game is not quite over yet at this stage. Let's move on to our next example. And what do we see here? Well, black at the moment is down in material, in fact down in exchange exactly. But it is black's turn, and that's a key why black is winning in this position. More specifically, what goes for black here is white's back rank problem. But the question is how to take advantage of that situation. Well, the black rook is already on the back rank, on the first rank on a1, but white has successfully blocked that check, for now at least, with the rook on e1. So one logical thread of thoughts would be trying to chase away the white queen from g3, the one that's protecting the rook on e1. Well, actually, black has seemingly two equally good ways to accomplish that. As we shall see, reality is that only one of it works. The correct move here is to play f4. h4, of course, would be the other one, and I'll point out why only this one works. Now the queen can only move to one square, where it will still protect the rook. So here, queen f2 is the only move. And now, what's the problem for white? It seems everything is being held together, no problems. But black has another amazing opportunity, and namely trying to distract the queen from protecting the rook. Can you think of that move? And yes, that move is queen d4. Now the white queen is under attack. If it would move simply away, then the other rook is hanging also on c5, so that's out of question. And after queen takes queen, the problem is not that black recaptures, but that black has an intermediate move by first capturing the white rook on e1 with a check. And when queen g1 comes about, which is the only move, takes, and this is the key, black had to foresee all of this, that now comes bishop d4 check, and when king moves, bishop takes rook, and black is in business. Black won a rook on this whole combination. Very nice. Going back to the beginning, let's compare what's the difference if black instead would push the other pawn, the h-pawn. There is a major difference in that after queen f2 and queen d4, now white has an intermediate check. That is, white can move the queen away by capturing the pawn on h4 and then leaving white the time, for example, after bishop h6, to retreat the rook and consolidate the position. Very nice example. Let's move on and see a full game how things can develop. White played e4, e6, the French defense, d4, d5, and white played knight d2, one of the main moves here, protecting the pawn on e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, so far all normal developing moves. And right now, black played bishop d7, which is considered not the very best. E takes d5, and now the best choice is, of course, to simply recapture on d5. But let's see what happens if black plays differently, namely knight takes pawn. This is already a serious mistake, giving white a significant advantage. White takes, pawn takes back. Of course, if bishop takes bishop right now, then simply knight takes back on b5, and white would have an extra piece, so black needs to capture on d4. And now things seem okay for black, more or less, after bishop d7, queen d7. But here comes the beautiful move that black overlooked, namely that now white can take on e6 and temporarily sacrifice the bishop on b5. Why? Because now would come pawn takes, which is a fork, so if king does not capture, then of course the pawn captures the knight on g8. And if the king does capture on f7, then the fork comes queen h5, and then winning back the sacrificed piece with queen b5, queen e7, and the queen comes back right on time, leaving white with a pleasant extra pawn. So all of this is wonderful from white's perspective. Let's see how the game continued after black captured back with a pawn. Beautifully, white still doesn't need to worry about the bishop hanging on b5. White can and should simply castle. That's what white did, and black captured on b5, and came queen h5 check, g6, and queen b5. We can see that all the black pieces are still in their initial positions on the back rank, while white has already castled, developed the knight, and has made moves with the queen. So white is clearly better. Black blocked the check, hoping to exchange queens when the lack of development or the king being in the middle of the board may be less important. It's true that black will not suffer directly from those issues. However, the problem will be that the pawn on d4 is getting in trouble immediately. White simply attacks the pawn with a knight. Bishop protects, and now white is immediately ready to win a pawn by knight takes, bishop takes, and pin. e5 and c3. Black cannot avoid losing the bishop, and then as an end result, as we are seeing, white is up a pawn. Now black should have pushed the pawn through, at least not to make things worse, opening the position against their king, which is still in the middle. Even though we're in an endgame, white has a very active position and the king is still in danger. And now, of course, so is the knight, which is in a pin. Black played rook d8. White follows up with rook d1, creating major threats of taking on f6 and then on d8. Rooks got exchanged, and black continued with rook c8, which of course has no threat because the bishop from g5 is guarding the back rank. However, it's a tricky move in that if white would play rook f4, trying to use the pin immediately, then indeed rook c1 would be checkmate. Just to show you, it's never too late to make a blunder. So white made the smart move, simply playing g3, making sure no more back rank dangers. Black played rook c7, and now rook f4 is timely. Rook c6. Now white is in no rush to do the trade on f6, but it's better to bring the king to the game first. King f7, and even here white could have played king f3 first, which is a better choice, but doing the general trade on f6, transposing to a pawn endgame, is also winning, and black resigned. A very well played game by white. And finally, let's see our jewel of the week. In this queen endgame, it is black who is up a pawn. Generally, that would imply that black is playing for a win. However, this is one of those rare situations when, because it is white's turn, white has a special situation that can decide the game to their favor. I suggest you take some time and try to figure out what is the winning sequence for white. It's not that complicated and not that long either, only 3 moves, and it's game over for black. Well, as generally in such situations, when you're down material, you need to look in the direction of forceful moves. And in this case, the correct answer is playing queen d4 first. A very natural move because it sort of creates an immediate skewer, meaning that the black king has only one square to go where it will still hang on to the queen on g7. So if now queen takes queen, king takes back, then black would be winning. The problem is white can do better, namely by playing f5, with the idea to invite the king to step away from the queen and then win the queen. Again, the only move to hang on to the queen would be to move to h6. But with this, now the black king is in the edge of the board, and because of that, white is ready to checkmate. Queen h4. What a beautiful solution. I hope you enjoyed this endgame composed by Progress. And by the way, this is only the end of that beautiful composition. It's maybe a bit too complicated for this level to see the complete art. But even the last 3 moves of it, I think, is quite impressive and brilliant. Well, what did we learn in this lesson? We learned about intermediate moves and unexpected moves. The message is, don't necessarily believe the first thing what things seems to be. As they say, not all that shines is gold. Well, with that, let me conclude this lesson and invite you back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.